nice evening in Geneva today. Unusual heat waves. Hopefully we'll have an equally heated debate tonight with our guests. It's supposed to be light-hearted. So my name is Florence Foster, for those who don't know me yet. I'm the Quaker United Nations Office Representative for Peace and Disarmament, and also your timekeeper for this evening. So I've got my phone, and I'll start tutting or just leaving the room if our speakers overrun their time. Before I give a few words of introduction to the topic of this evening, just quickly introduce our speakers this evening. So Richard, who most of you know, is currently the Executive Director of the Geneva Disarmament Platform and brings with him a long experience in the multilateral settings of disarmament and arms control. And notably, as a lot of people of you might already know, brings with him a little bit of wit and spice in what is a doomsday subject. Aidan, who is new in town for many of us, is the ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament for the UK, and has been working for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office since 2003. And Gaukhar, who is in the middle there, is our out-of-town expert for today, and is the current director of the International Organizations and Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and has, amongst many other things, served as an expert for the delegation for Kazakhstan at the 2010 NPT Review Conference. So, perhaps for a little background on today's lecture and reactions from our two experts. In 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, infamously known for many of you as the TPNW, was negotiated and adopted despite the bitter opposition of the P5 nuclear weapon states. The P5, for those of you who don't know, are Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, present here today, and the United States. They all oppose the TPNW, which they see as contrary to their core security interests. Yet despite the formidable diplomatic and political resources at their disposal, they failed to prevent its negotiation and final adoption. Richard's lecture this evening will trace the emergence and development of the humanitarian movement that led to the adoption of the TPNW, and identify and analyze the 5 critical errors the P5 made at various stages of the process that unwittingly broadened the support for the TPNW and accelerated its process. So following the trip down the P5's memory lane of mistakes, Aidan and Gaukhar, with 10 minutes each, will react to this lecture, and hopefully we will be able to engage with some of you from the audience, as well with your reactions and questions to the panel. A couple of disclaimers to this evening as we move forward. We've taken a very light-hearted approach to this topic, but please bear in mind that we don't underestimate the seriousness of it. So please join us in the light-hearted mood, while also recognizing that seriousness of the topic. With that in mind, this is not a discussion about the merits or otherwise of the TPNW, and we are in no way going to try and get you to sign up to it at the end of the evening, but equally this is not the space to discuss its pros and cons. It's more a light-hearted way of also looking at, learning from hindsight and looking at the odd happenings of the diplomatic spaces we all navigate. So Richard, the floor is yours. You get 30 minutes. That's what you told me.
I'm not walking out, by the way.
Okay, thank you very much, Florence. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Just to start, perhaps by reinforcing what Florence just said, this is not about the TPNW as such. Whatever opinion you have of that treaty, good, bad, indifferent, I promise you will leave tonight with the same opinion intact. So, and that goes especially for Aidan. But it's more about the story of how the treaty came to be and what that tells us about the forces that are at play when we're talking about nuclear diplomacy, about nuclear disarmament. And perhaps what we can learn about that as we move forward. We've got the NPT Review Conference coming up, so I know we're all interested in how we can find a way forward towards what I hope will be clear as our common goal. So this lecture, this idea for this event tonight really was inspired by this quote, which I happened across on Twitter a few weeks ago. Georges Bidault was a French politician, and he has this rather pithy expression, which just reminded me that what I thought at the time, while the TPNW was being developed, while the humanitarian initiative was underway, that without wanting to take anything away from all those governments and civil society, in particular ICAN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, without of course diminishing their efforts and contribution at all, it was plain to me at the time that a big contribution to the success or the emergence, the creation of this treaty, was what the P5 did, and the way they reacted and how they handled themselves throughout different stages in the process. And to me this is very interesting. Of course, many of you know me, I'm a pretty fanatical proponent of the TPNW myself, and I, of course, naturally I was quite pleased that things went the way they did and that we have this treaty. But I've been a diplomat. I used to work for the Australian government. I know what it's like, what many of you do, and as this process unfolded, I was that foreign policy official still inside me somewhere kept looking at what the P5 are doing, thinking, are they sure this is a good idea? Because it just seemed to me they made several quite important missteps. Now, whether, of course, you agree with me that they are errors or are missteps, that's what we're going to talk about later, and I'm very much looking forward to Aidan's view on this, knowing that he wasn't personally involved. So we're going to look at this tonight. Again, I emphasise not as is the TPNW good, or is it bad, or is it a threat, or is it a bonus? No. It's purely as a kind of multilateral chess problem. We're all going to put ourselves, imagine we're in the P5, something has happened. There's this new movement, the Humanitarian Impact Initiative. It looks like it might turn into a new treaty banning nuclear weapons. Your job as the P5, you want to stop this. We can argue and discuss how important this was, how much of a concern this was to the P5. But there's no question, I think, certainly to those of you who are on the receiving end of démarches from those countries, the P5 wanted to stop this. And they would have, at least we can say, been much happier if it just went away. So that's our issue. On the other side, that's the issue with the P5. For the other side, the challenge was really quite different. This whole idea of a ban treaty, if we go back to its origins, I'm going to start this story in early 2013. We can trace it further back to the 2010 Review Conference and the first humanitarian statements. But for tonight, since we don't have too long, we'll start in 2013. And at this stage, it's kind of viewed now as maybe it was a big conspiracy all along. But if we go back to early 2013, the number of people who really clearly saw this idea of having a banned treaty that would prohibit nuclear weapons without the nuclear weapon states on board was vanishingly small. It wasn't a group, it was a sprinkling of crazy individuals in both government and civil society. And somehow this, it couldn't even be said to be a movement, but somehow they had to shift the sort of position, the orientation of non-nuclear weapon states from what somebody, I think it was a Norwegian academic, described very actively as moralizing spectators. The non-nuclear weapon states sit there, they complain, nuclear weapon states haven't disarmed, they haven't done this, they haven't implemented Article 6, that's not good enough, which of course we can all sympathise with, but they were not actors, they were spectators, they were complaining, and that's what they saw as their role. And the whole idea of the ban treaty was then to shift them into being actors, no longer just sitting there complaining, but actually doing something themselves. And we thought, or the people who came up with this crazy idea thought, that the only logical thing that they could do themselves, without the nuclear states, would be to have a legal prohibition, a ban treaty. So this was the challenge for the ban treaty proponents, really shift that great mass of non-nuclear weapons states into this new mode of operation. And it was a real challenge. I mean, it was very difficult, and the reasons it was difficult were two big obstacles to this. Perceptions, we can say. The first perception is like kind of the obvious objection, which is always the first thing anybody says who doesn't know much about this. When you say, oh, there's a nuclear ban treaty, it bans nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have any of the nuclear weapon states on board. And most people say, which is was also my own reaction, Well, what's the point of that? It's just a nonsense idea. How could that possibly work? How could it be effective? Why would the nuclear weapon states care? I mean, what's it to them? A bunch of other countries, small countries, go and negotiate new treaties, so what? And this was a real problem to get non-nuclear weapon states to understand that maybe it could change something. The other obstacle or perception that was really a problem to overcome was this idea that the existing approaches, the Conference on Disarmament, the NPT process, the so-called step-by-step approach and so on, that these are working, that they're making progress. I mean, the nuclear weapon states have a very good argument. They've made these enormous reductions of 80% or whatever it is of their arsenals since the height of the Cold War. You know, it's all going fine. If not fine, at least it's on the right track. And so, you know, why do you want to go off and do this strange other thing? Now, my thesis tonight is that the P5 really played a very important role in overcoming both these obstacles, which I don't think was their intention, but perhaps I'm wrong on that. Nevertheless, I hope to show you in the next 25 minutes how that happened. So we'll start with a quick look at the timeline. I don't know if this works as a pointer. Yes, it does. So, as I say, we're starting in 2013 with the Oslo Humanitarian Impact Conference, the Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons in Oslo in 2013. That was followed soon after by the first of two open-ended working groups. These were groups convened by the General Assembly of the United Nations to discuss taking forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. Moving to 2014, we had then a follow-up humanitarian impact conference in Nayarit, Mexico, in February 2014, and then Vienna, the third humanitarian impact conference, at the end of 2014. That then launched the so-called humanitarian pledge. But then there was a bit of a pause, and things slowed down for a while, mainly because I think of the NPT review conference, which was in mid-2015. Things got rolling again in 2016 with the second open-ended working group, which met 3 times in 2016, and that led to the vote at the General Assembly to convene the negotiations on a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Negotiations took place in the first half of 2017, ended in July 2017, and as we know, the treaty was then signed in September. So just bear that sort of timeline in mind, because as we go through, the 5 errors that we're going to look at occur at different points on this line, and the time they occurred is also important. So this is the part you've been waiting for. Let's get into the meat of it. 5 errors. I've listed them both in more or less chronological order, but also in order of significance. That is, it's the early ones that were most significant and made the biggest difference. And as we go on through the process, you'll see, in a way, the errors get more and more kind of ridiculous, but also less important because things were already going ahead, and there was really nothing that the P5 or anyone else could do about it. So, error number 1, and this is really the big one from my point of view, boycotting the 2013 Oslo Humanitarian Impact Conference. A nice quote from Woody Allen, but really, the P5 decided jointly, essentially, not to go to the Oslo conference. Not only did they decide jointly, but they made a joint démarche to the Norwegian Foreign Ministry to sort of announce that they would not be joining and to complain about the conference, which they saw as a distraction from the existing processes. Now, they also boycotted about the same time, also in 2013, the open-ended working group for similar reasons. And this, I think, was really a very fundamental mistake that set the tone for the rest of the adventure. Why was boycotting Oslo and the open-ended working group a mistake? Firstly, and I think most importantly, it showed that they cared. If you go back to that first obstacle we the ban proponents, had to overcome, it was like, well, why would the P5, to use the diplomatic term, why would they give a shit? But this showed that they did. They cared enough to convene amongst themselves, to consult, to wonder what to do about it, to make a joint démarche to the Norwegians, to explain themselves in the Conference on Disarmament. They made separate statements, but they'd obviously been coordinated because the language was very similar. And it really, all this kind of, they also agonized about it for a couple of months. Whether they would go, would they, maybe the Brits were said they probably might, but the French didn't want to. And it was this kind of agonizing, I think, that gave the big clue that the people were really thinking and worried about this. And this is important because it was a signal that could not be retracted. Even if they'd later decided, and in fact, I'm sure someone would point out anyway, the UK and the US did go to the third humanitarian conference in Vienna in December 2014. But this is all too late. It was that initial decision that sent the signal, we care. We're concerned by this, we're disconcerted, we're not quite sure how to react, we're spending a lot of sort of mental energy, policy energy, agitating about this. We care. And this was a tremendously important signal that they sent out later. The other thing that happened was by deciding not to participate in Oslo and in the open-ended working group, they really, the US and France and UK at least, threw their allies under a bus by essentially forcing them into the front line as defenders of nuclear weapons. Because the P5 weren't there to say why nuclear weapons are important or why they were doing it the way they're doing it. It fell to countries like Australia and Canada and Germany and Netherlands and Japan to make the case, well, this is why we need to keep nuclear weapons, or this is why we've devoted to the step-by-step process. And this was not a role which they were used to. And it was not a role they were very well equipped to carry out. They really see themselves, for some reason, as bridge builders. They're the ones who make the compromises, who bridge the gaps between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. But by the P5 withdrawing and shoving their allies into the front row to say, you tell them why we need nuclear weapons, they really destroyed the credibility of those alliance states. And if we go back to our image of the chess player, if we're thinking of multilateral politics as a chess game, one of the important principles of chess is to develop your pieces. And under most theories of chess, it's not a good idea to develop your pieces by throwing them under the bus. So they really squandered, I think, a very important asset by essentially neutralizing the Allied states from much of the debate. And I will just intervene here because I've got a little video to show you just to illustrate the principle. That's the P5x.
You just got promoted.
So they really, they didn't do any favours to their allies, but they, most importantly, didn't do any favours to themselves. The third reason that boycotting Oslo was a mistake is that, and I don't think anyone could have predicted this. I think perhaps we could say that if the P5 had thought a bit more about what they're doing, they might have thought of those first two reasons. But the third one is perhaps a bit unexpected, was to me anyway, that it really changed the dynamic of the debate. Because when the P5 and the nuclear weapon states are present in a discussion about nuclear weapons, everything is about them, which is perfectly natural. I mean, they're the ones with the weapons. And so if you look, even the body language of delegates in the conference room, they're all orientated towards the US, Russia, China. They're all, this is all about what can we persuade them to do? What can we get them to agree to? What concessions can we wring from the P5? It's all focused on them. But if you take them away, if they're just absent, people find other things to talk about. And at first it was a bit odd because, well, we don't know how to talk about nuclear weapons or nuclear disarmament without the P5. But people quickly got used to it, and they found that not only was it possible and quite productive, it was also much more fun. Because you're talking about possibilities, and everyone tends to agree. It's a much more like-minded group, and it shows new areas of exploration discussion that really don't come up when the P5 are there. This is not to say that the P5 sort of suppress debate or anything, or that they dominate the proceedings, although sometimes they do. But it's more about just the orientation of the non-nuclear weapon states. Are they waiting for someone else to do something? They're waiting for the P5 to act? Or are they thinking more about, well, what can we do? And so by removing themselves from this discussion, the P5 really sort of opened up this space for the non-nuclear weapon states to look at alternatives. And I think, you know, if you made one difference, if the P5 had gone to Oslo and participated in that debate, which would have been very easy for them. I mean, they know how to do this. You know, they could go there and say, yes, you know, we're very concerned about the humanitarian consequence of nuclear weapons. That's why we support the NPT. That's why we've made an unequivocal undertaking to achieve the complete elimination of our arsenals. You know, that's what motivates us. Congratulations on having this conference. We can all work together to reinvigorate our... You know, the speech writes itself. And yet, they didn't do that. And I think if they had done that, we wouldn't have a TPNW now. We'd still be talking about humanitarian impact. Everyone would be thinking, how can we keep the P5 engaged? This is going really well. Maybe there'd be some sort of subsidiary body in the NPT to talk about humanitarian consequences. But I really doubt it would have taken off the way the humanitarian initiative and the TPNW would have taken off the way that it did. Okay, error number 2, talking up the security benefits of nuclear weapons. This one is kind of a natural reflex. You have this new initiative where people are talking about the terrible humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. They're not exactly pointing the finger at you, but they're saying, you know, this is a terrible risk, we must do something about this, we cannot tolerate it, and so on. So it's perfectly understandable, natural reflex to say, well, no, I mean, it's not just about the humanitarian consequences. Nuclear weapons also have important security benefits, and we talk about deterrence and stability and so on. Now, I'm not going to argue with the arguments here. I mean, you all have your own opinions on deterrence and so on. Even if we accept them at face value, the question is, was this a sensible reaction? Was this an effective reaction to the humanitarian initiative? Did it, you know, did it help meet the P5 interests and slow things down, or put them onto a more acceptable track, or did it actually inflame and give more momentum to the movement? And it's pretty clearly the latter. Now we could look at all kinds of examples here, but I just want to focus on this one from the UK, because the UK is particular, you know, as custodian of the English language, has a particular talent for putting the essence of the matter into a very short sentence. So this is something that Aidan's predecessor, Ambassador Matthew Rowland, said at the NPT PrepCom in 2014. We consider that nuclear weapons have helped to guarantee our security and that of our allies for decades. We want a world without them. Why? Why would you want a world without them if they've helped to guarantee your security and that of your allies for decades? I mean, bear in mind, these are the same countries that have said, you know, we've made unequivocal commitment, we want a nuclear disarmament, we want a peace and security of a world free of nuclear weapons. What's your motivation here? How are we, non-nuclear weapon states, to believe you're sincere when you put these two things together like this and say, we consider the nuclear weapons are great, they're very important for us, but we do want to get rid of them. Why do you want to get rid of them? They never explained this. And again, there was a tremendous opportunity missed. They could have gone to the humanitarian impact conference and said, that's why I want to get rid of them. You know, and talk about the humanitarian consequences. Yes, this is what's made. This is why we've made these commitments. This is why we joined the NPT. Instead, they went the other way and focused on the security benefits, which immediately calls into question their sincerity. Or if not their sincerity, at least their realism. I mean, we want a world without them, but they deliver these great benefits to you. Why do you want a world without them? And this was compounded by, you know, some very unfortunate statements. I think this one's from early 2015, a speech by French president at the time, Francois Hollande, who said, our nuclear weapons allow us to preserve our freedom of action and decision in all circumstances, ruling out any threat of blackmail. Our nuclear forces must be capable of inflicting absolutely unacceptable damage to the adversary's centres of power, its political, economic and military nerve centres. You know, this is just the complete antithesis of the humanitarian narrative. And, you know, obviously it sounds like something that Kim Jong-un would say. And it was very easy then for supporters to say, look, do you really believe the P5 are serious about disarming? Look at what the President of France is saying. It's indistinguishable from North Korea's approach. And we don't, we would never accept this from North Korea. Why do we take it from France? And it just added to this idea that the current procedures, the current processes, that second obstacle we looked at the beginning, you're never going to be able to overcome it because the P5, and we're not going to dispute their reasoning, but it's clear that they are absolutely committed to retaining nuclear weapons. So why would you put your faith in processes that have run until now? So again, it made a big contribution to shifting the movement, to the mood, let's say, of non-nuclear weapon states. And this was compounded, again, not just by this emphasis on the security benefits of nuclear weapons, but that was coupled a little bit later on with sort of watering down or backing away from the existing commitments to disarm. So you look at Barack Obama's famous speech in Prague in 2009, states clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I mean, all Barack Obama had to do was go to Oslo and say exactly that, and none of this would have ever happened. NPT Review Conference 2010, reaffirming the unequivocal undertaking of the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of nuclear arsenals, etc. And again, this is a tremendous asset. This commitment, this undertaking is the P5's #1 sort of badge of sincerity and commitment. And instead of putting this front and centre, they put it, mention it in passing and then go on and on about security and deterrence. But then they also, a little bit later, started to back away from this stuff. So if you look at the G7 Hiroshima Declaration, there's also a NATO conference statement around the same time, that it's gone from a commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons to a commitment to a safer world for all and creating conditions for a world without nuclear weapons, that in a way that promotes international stability, and it's all difficult, and North Korea and stuff. So again, this is not to dispute that it's difficult or that they want to have the conditions or they want to retain international stability. It's like, what is the signal here? The signal here is we are kind of addicted, we're committed to the security benefits of our nuclear weapons, and we're kind of wondering if we should have made all those commitments in the first place. And they're inching back from them. And again, what signal does this send to those who are thinking about whether to support or not the humanitarian initiative? Okay, error number 3, moving right along. This is where things got really interesting. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one. It came to the crunch at the 2016 session of the first committee, and this is where it came to a vote on whether to commence negotiations on a TPNW. Here's Dale Carnegie's famous work, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I put that up because that's exactly what the P5 did not do at this first committee. I'll just blow up the little blurb from the cover there. What are the 6 ways of making people like you? They did not make anyone like them, not even their allies. 12 ways of winning people to your way of thinking. I don't know how many people they won over, not very many, if any. And 9 ways to change people without giving offence or rousing resentment. I don't know if they changed anyone, but they certainly gave an enormous, it was a month-long masterclass in giving offence and arousing resentment. We just have to wonder what the game was here. We'll just come back, we need a little bit of context for this, so we're just coming back to the timeline. You've noticed that blank spot in 2015 when nothing much is happening. And I've drawn a little thing here to show that this is, up until early 2016, the non-nuclear weapon states, the proponents of the ban treaty, really pushing the thing up the hill. It was really tough going. Wasn't a lot of traction, not many people getting on board, a slow process, really got becalmed in 2015. And the tide really turned in February 2016, quite suddenly. I'll tell you why in a second. But I think what happened was that the P5 had also been quite aggressive at the NPT Review Conference and at the 2015 First Committee. And I think they decided perhaps that this kind of really assertive aggression approach against this initiative was working. Things had slowed down, got bogged down, nothing moving so fast, and so we'll carry on along that line. But what happened in 2016 was you had the second open-ended working group. States really started, non-nuclear weapon states started to explore in more detail this nuclear ban idea, what it would mean. And very importantly, I'm very pleased to have the Ambassador of Brazil here tonight, because it was Brazil who in February 2016 quite suddenly announced that Brazil actually endorsed this proposal of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. And not only did they endorse it, but they came up with a very, very clever kind of packaging of the concept, which said that we still support a comprehensive nuclear weapons convention, which is the official position of the non-aligned movement and many non-nuclear weapons. Brazil said, we still support that, that's what we want, but we think you can split that comprehensive nuclear weapons convention into three. There's a prohibition part, there's the disarmament part, and the verification part. The prohibition part we can do now. We don't need the nuclear weapon states for that. And then the disarmament and verification, that comes later. And that sort of unlocked the gates for support from the non-aligned movement. So Brazil kind of, in February 2016, Brazil kind of arrived with the cavalry and said, okay, this is how we're going to do it. And suddenly that ball began to roll downhill very fast. From sort of 3 years of grind, suddenly off we go. And so when they came to their first committee towards the end of 2016, I think the P5, it was a bit like Colonel Custer in the Indian Wars in the US, arriving at Little Bighorn to find that the opposition was much larger and better organised and more determined than he'd anticipated. The P5 showed up ready to sort of use their usual disparaging strategy. And are confronted instead with a very formidable alliance, coalition of now like-minded states. Because at the end of the open-ended working group, we had group statements from CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, from the African Union, from ASEAN, all committing to this, explicitly supporting a treaty banning nuclear weapons. I just give a little quick shout out to my own country, Australia, which precipitated this situation by questioning whether there was, in the open-ended working group, they questioned whether there was in fact a majority in support of such a treaty, which at that stage it was a fair question because it wasn't clear. But of course, immediately the groups rounded up and they all got together and issued statements, and so 48 hours later it was clear. And so when we go into the first committee, you've got the P5 kind of not knowing what's about to hit them. You've got the non-nuclear weapon states really very much on a roll. They have a plan, they have the numbers, they know they have the numbers. It's all just quite quickly come together. And so the result was absolute carnage. P5 came in very aggressive, very demeaning, disparaging, rude. Well, look, you don't need to take my word for this. I'll show you examples. And this was obvious even early on. I mean, this is something a blogger posted as wildfire, imagining what was going on behind the scenes. What were the P5 saying to each other? And the French ambassador saying, the non-nuclear weapon states are restless and agitated. They say they're fed up with our inaction, hypocrisy, dismissal of their concerns and general arrogance. They're going ahead with this ban treaty resolution. What shall we do? And the UK ambassador says, ramp up the dismissal and arrogance. Good call, says the US ambassador. Fist bump. That actually happened, the fist bump, by the way. Sadly not recorded on camera. And then the French ambassador, another whiskey gentleman. Now, the day after I posted this, the UK ambassador tracked me down in the conference room to complain, not because of the content, but because I spelled whiskey with an E. But this is, this was so clear that the P5 was taking this approach and it was not working. You had the number of co-sponsors consistently growing on the ban treaty resolution throughout the committee, but they did not change their approach. And let's just have a look at how this works so you can understand what's going on. Here's one from Russia. The initiative to prohibit nuclear weapons is destructive. It's hasty, it undermines, erodes, it's catastrophic, deadly, destructive repercussions, deceive ourselves, unfounded illusions. And they read this twice, actually. Once in the general statement at the beginning, and then once just before the vote, just to make sure everyone had really got the idea. Again, it's not a question of whether this is factually accurate. It's not a question of whose assessment is correct or not. What effect does this have on non-nuclear weapon states who may be undecided? Will this make them more or less likely to vote yes on the resolution? And I mean, we can presume, and perhaps Aidan can tell us later, what the P5 strategy was at this first committee. Presumably either to get rid of the resolution altogether, to merge it with something else or derail it somehow. Failing that, to vote it down. Or failing that, to have it pass but with the smallest possible majority, to show that support is marginal and patchy. But everything they did acted to actually drive people to vote for it. Look at some more. France, we would be deluding ourselves. We believe that such a treaty, designed without the nuclear weapon possessing states, could have the slightest concrete impact. And then a bit later on, such an instrument would also have a destabilising effect on regional and international security. Now, I don't know about you, but I would consider a destabilising effect on regional and international security to be quite a serious concrete impact. But yeah, I don't know if the French read their statements right through or what. But again, what is the effect on people listening to this? France again. Only constructive open dialogue can help us move forward. Nothing positive can be expected from this growing change. Circumventing, hardening divisions. I love this. Therefore, France calls all parties to return to the traditional, legitimate forums for disarmament where deadlocks have gone on for too long. You make that sound so attractive, France. Here we are, after 40 years of frustration, nothing working, we want action, we want breakthrough. No, we want you to go back to the traditional forums where they're all deadlocked. Again, how is this message going to be received? It's not to dispute France's interpretation. I mean, I would, but you don't need to dispute it. It's this clear failure to think about how will this message be received? Who are we trying to influence? When they hear this, what will they think? 5 minutes, okay. France, again, something that needs to be built, cannot be decreed. There's deeds more than words, and so on. And so we need to, that's why the NPT 2010 action plan remains our roadmap. We will continue to play its full role, blah, blah, blah. May I remind you, depends on our collective responsibility. This is a bit of a theme coming up here. This idea that somehow it's the non-nuclear weapon states who are responsible for the action plan not going very well. You know, non-nuclear weapon states really need to get back to working on that. USA, frustration is not a compelling reason to abandon an approach. And again, there is now a proposal to abandon this proven course. Nobody had suggested abandoning anything. I mean, again, this suggests that somehow the problem is that non-nuclear weapon states have shirked their obligations or moved away from what they're supposed to be doing, which they hadn't. And I want you to think about it. Put yourself in the position of Indonesia or Nigeria or Egypt and think about how this, you're making up your mind whether to vote yes on this resolution. And here you have the P5 having the cheek to blame you for the fact that things are not going very well. And here again, US, let us rededicate ourselves to doing the hard work together to create the conditions. It's like, we never stop dedicating ourselves. Again, a very clear failure to just think about how will this message be received? Will this persuade people to vote for or against the resolution? Then the UK, which is very interesting. The UK didn't actually talk about the ban treaty in its formal statements at all. It made an off-the-record, as an informal session, very strongly critical intervention against the treaty, but that's kind of lost to history because it was off the record. What they did say in the formal statement was not about any of this. It was explaining their decision to renew the Trident submarines. And again, what is the message? You know, points for transparency and everything, but what is the message that's going to be received here? The US is planning to retain its arsenal essentially forever, because it's talking about not just needing it to deal with current threats, but unimagined threats that we don't even know are going to exist. So how much confidence would this kind of statement give to non-nuclear weapon states that if they just keep going in the standard channels that everything's going to be okay? And finally, the best one of all, Russia. Let us remind, again this word remind comes up a lot, because lecturing people is always a good way to get them to vote the way you want. Remind those who for some reason wish to close their eyes to this fact that pursuant to the NPT, 5 states possess nuclear weapons with absolute legitimacy. Do you think maybe there's a small problem when you're talking to and trying to influence a number of non-nuclear weapon states who see the fact that the NPT somehow allows 5 states to retain their nuclear? That is the problem they're trying to solve. They want that to be not legitimate. That's why they're proposing to develop a new treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons for everyone. So again, I question Russia, how are you going to persuade anybody saying, here is the problem, here is the problem? I just don't think they really thought through their communication here. Then we have things like NPT Protection Record, sort of implied threats that maybe pursuing a ban treaty would compromise peaceful cooperation in NPT, which is a kind of standover tactic, I guess. It was certainly interpreted that way. I don't know if the US intended this as a threat. But again, how are these messages received? And then just some really silly stuff, totally over the top. The United States saying that a nuclear ban treaty is going to lead to the possible use of a nuclear weapon. And my favourite of all, Russia plunge the world into chaos and dangerous unpredictability. Okay, you don't need to like the ban treaty and all this whole idea, but you see that maybe there's just slightly over-egging this. And it was very easy to make fun of. It was very easy to illustrate to the non-nuclear weapon states that the P5 are not serious, they don't have any serious arguments, they're not taking you seriously. If you want to show them that you are serious, vote on L41, vote yes. That's not actually what Russia said, but it was pretty close. All right, I'm running out of time. Just to show just how obnoxious the P5 were playing this, here's a tweet from ICANN. The ambassador, Robert Wood, I don't think he's here tonight, but he went to talk to the African group during First Committee to persuade them to vote no to this resolution, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I mean, this is what ambassadors do, right? But such was the atmosphere that ICANN managed to make this look like some sort of sinister plot. You've got the blurry surveillance photos and the court. And it didn't help that within 48 hours of this event, 4 more African countries, Angola, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, and Sierra Leone, had become co-sponsors of the resolution. So, I mean, ICANN just lapped this up. I mean, it allowed them to totally dominate the narrative, and they brought to New York this unrivaled lobbying machine, which just, they knew this was the make or break moment. They brought to New York everything, their last penny, their last man and woman, rang the phones day and night, went to the missions, dragged delegates in, sat them down. They really ran a truly formidable campaign, but the P5 really made it easy for them. And the results, well, we'll just have a quick look at the video. Do this.
The committee will now proceed to take action on draft resolution L41 entitled Taking Forward Multilateral Nuclear Disarmament Negotiations.
The voting machine is unlocked. Delegations are kindly requested to indicate their votes on the board.
Keep your eye on China, though.
Will all delegations confirm that their votes are accurately reflected on the board?
The result of the voting is as follows: 123 in favor, 38 against, 16 abstained. Draft resolution L41 is adopted. There should be cheers for all resolutions, not only this one.
So it was a pretty decisive result. And do you notice, I mean, China abstained, along with India and Pakistan. So not only did the P5 fail to persuade any or many non-nuclear weapon states, they in the end didn't even persuade themselves. Okay, error number 4, very quickly. This is a real own goal. This is not the P5, really. The US, like this lonely goalkeeper, did this one all by itself. For reasons I'm not entirely sure I understand, the US sent a memo, a non-paper, to its NATO allies. This was an unclassified document, which meant it was leaked immediately. And of course, ICANN got its sticky hands all over it. It said, so this is, the finest analytical minds in the US foreign policy and defense establishment, and they said things like this. basically listed a whole number of reasons that they thought a ban treaty would work as advertised. I guess this was an attempt to persuade their allies, to have nothing to do with it, but it was just a total gift to ICAN. And I found here are some ICAN campaign materials from mid-2016, so 3, 4, 5 months before the US-NATO memo. So ICAN says a ban treaty will have normative and practical impacts on those that stand inside and outside of it. US could impact non-parties as well as parties, and could even have an impact prior to its entry into force. Good. ICAN said this ban treaty would have wide-ranging implications for nuclear weapons, including pressures on military cooperation involving nuclear weapons. US says could make it impossible to undertake nuclear planning or training, or nuclear-related transit through territorial airspace or seas. Match. ICAN. The treaty will prohibit reliance on the nuclear weapons of other states and will thus force states in nuclear alliances to review their positions. US could and is designed by ban advocates to destroy the basis for US nuclear extended deterrence. I don't know what else to say about this. Tip for young players, don't do this. It contradicted the US's public positions. It totally validated what ICAN was saying. ICAN essentially just throw away its campaign materials and just hand over the US memo to states who are on the fence. So look, it'll work. US says so. All right, final error. Advertising the enemy's success. I want you to introduce you to one of my favourite characters from history, Major General Ambrose Burnside, a general of the Union Army in the US Civil War. His name is where we get the word sideburns. I'll let you work out why. And he was, by all accounts, a very fine fellow and someone you would want at your dinner party, but he wasn't a great hit as a general, and he had a number of rather awkward defeats, the best of which was called the Battle of the Crater. This was late in the war. The war was essentially won for the Union. It was just wearing down the last of the Confederate resistance. And there was a siege outside Petersburg, which was on the way to Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. And they had this idea, the Union side had this idea under Burnside's command, to dig a tunnel under the Confederate fortifications, fill it with gunpowder, blow it up, and make a huge hole in the lines, and then charge through. Okay, very cunning. The problem was that they carried out this plan, they blew up this huge, colossal explosion, made this enormous crater in the ground. The Union troops, due to an unfortunate series of miscommunications, then raced down into the crater, where they were trapped and then massacred by the Confederates who just stood around the edge shooting down at them. And somebody said, as a historian said, only Burnside could have managed such a coup, bringing one last spectacular defeat from the jaws of victory. But the P5 went one better, at least the P3. This Russia and China can take no blame for this. US, UK and France managed somehow to bring one last spectacular defeat from the jaws of defeat, because the ban treaty was already underway. The negotiations started. Opening day of the negotiations, the United States leads a kind of protest outside the negotiations at the UN headquarters. So these people you see in this photo, Ambassador Nikki Haley, the US and UK and French ambassadors, surrounded by a kind of bodyguard of ambassadors from allied US allies, standing outside the General Assembly chamber to explain why they think TPNW is a bad idea. Now, what does this communicate? Here are people who literally sideline themselves. They're on the sidelines, literal sidelines, having sidelined themselves. So they look, we're on the sidelines, and things that are going on there, we're not doing them, but we're going to stand outside here and do it. It's really communicated impotence. They failed to do anything about this. They're reduced to holding a protest like NGOs. NGOs found this just hilarious, that here's all these important ambassadors like holding a cake stall outside the General Assembly chamber. And what were these allies there doing? They didn't say anything. I mean, none of these people took any questions from the media. It was billed as a press conference. Nikki Haley made a statement. I think the French and UK colleagues did also. The rest just stood there like kind of props. And they didn't even have placards to hold. So we fixed that with a bit of Photoshop. And again, what is being communicated here? You're just giving a big push to what's going on inside the room. You're really showing that you have failed day one. But we introduced a term at the beginning of this talk. Can anyone remember what it was that describes the role of the non-nuclear weapon state at the beginning? It's the moralizing spectators, right? And somehow, as Darth Vader would say, the circle is now complete. The non-nuclear weapon states were in there doing the acting, and the P5 is standing outside whining about it. It was just complete transformation. But the most important effect of this, that sort of cheered everybody up, but the most important effect was that put the TPNW on the front pages of world media. And this is something that ICANN had singularly failed to do. For all the things that went well, they just couldn't get the media to get interested in this thing. They couldn't see why it was significant. So Nikki Haley succeeded where ICANN failed, all sorts of coverage, and I think that was also a factor in helping ICANN come to the attention of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. So, okay, 5 failures. Why? Perhaps I'll stop and we'll talk about that. I think people have made some serious miscalculations. Ulysses S. Grant on Custer's last stand, it's just unnecessary. So much of the reactions, they could have done nothing at all and it would have been better for them. They could have done better than nothing. But it just keeps coming back to this is a tweet about the Hanoi summit. Yeah? North Korea doesn't give up its nuclear weapons because it doesn't want to. And same for the P5. They just don't want to, but that's fine. They just need to own up to that and deal with that. And I'll just finish with this. This is what the P5 could have said. But I think if they'd gone to Oslo and participated in the humanitarian initiative, they would have stopped all this stuff. It would have been diverted into the usual talk fest, and none of this would have. But even if it didn't, even if they said, well, we'll go and participate, and then this ban treaty happened anyway, they wouldn't be any worse off than they are now. In fact, they'd be better off, because they wouldn't have all this bad blood and burned bridges and bad feeling leading into the NPT. So, what the P5 could have said, and I think what they could still say, I don't think they will, but it would make their own lives easier and make everybody happier. Nobody can force them to join a treaty. Nobody can force North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. It doesn't want to. You don't want to give up the nuclear weapons. You don't have to. Nobody can make you do it. But the funny thing in all this process was the P5 were talking and acting as if they thought it could be decreed, that they could be forced to disarm. And they were frightened of this. But there's just no prospect of that happening. And as Bob, I don't know if you were at the 40th anniversary CD event the other day, as Bob Aidan saying, you couldn't understand the reluctance to start negotiations. If you don't like the result, you don't have to join the treaty. The US hasn't ratified the CTB for 20 years. There's no danger of them being somehow tricked into joining the TPNW. So I think if they'd let it go, or even endorsed it, it would have all ended much more happily. They certainly wouldn't have been any worse off. So I'll stop there. I've gone way over time. Thank you for your patience, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
The timekeeping is hard with Richard, so I apologise to everyone in advance. But we have wine for later. So now I invite our two panelists back to respond, and I'll be slightly lenient, but I'll try and wave when you get to close to 10 minutes each, and then we'll open up to the floor. And please don't be shy. It is supposed to be light-hearted, and that means that more people should participate from the floor. We will finish promptly at 7 so that we can all go and continue the conversation outside. So, Aidan, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Richard, for that interesting lecture. I disagree with almost all of it, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? Where do we start? So I suppose the starting point is 2 caveats. Firstly, although this is billed as if the P5 was a sort of monolith that had a sort of synchronized brain that strategized every last move, that wasn't the case. It's never the case, I think. And for the purposes of this evening, when you talk about the P5, you're talking about little old me, because I'm the only one of the P5 here. I'm not going to pretend to argue in favour of what Russia or China or the US or France did. I can only speak for what we did and what we were thinking. Caveat number 2, I wasn't there. I've been the disarmament ambassador here for about 6 months. This all happened in the time of my predecessor. I've spoken to my predecessor about it on numerous occasions, and others who were there. So if I muddle my dates or if I misrepresent what happened, I apologise in advance, but I can't sort of pretend I was there at the time. But I think the most important thing to say is that I challenge Richard's premise that we were somehow trying to stop this. The whole premise of your lecture is that we made 5 mistakes in trying to stop something, and that sort of made it more inevitable, as I understand it. Speaking just for the UK, I don't think we did try to stop it. We could see that this was happening. I think we were very consistent in our approach to setting out what we thought the implications of this would be. I make no apology for the fact that we talked to our allies about the implications as we thought they would be. But I don't think we were ever under any illusion that we could stop it, should stop it, or should even try. I mean, it's none of our business to stop a treaty that other people want to sign. But I think it was important that people understood the interpretation that we had of the treaty, and that they understood the implications, particularly for coordinating or cooperating with nuclear weapons states. And this comes back to the US paper that we'll talk about in a bit. I think that's been borne out by some of the things that have been written by serious people about the ban treaty since. I think the reports from the Swedish inquiry on this and the Swiss inquiry on this kind of bear out a lot of what we were saying at the time. So I think we've been consistent about it, but we certainly never thought we could stop it, even if we wanted to. And I think just to come back to your very last quote, Richard, because I think that's kind of it's interesting. What the P5 should have said. I would be surprised even if we had said that at the time, or if we said it now, it would have made a blind bit of difference either way. And I'd be interested in others' views from other states that were engaged in this at the time. You know, would us saying that at the time really have altered the course of history? I suspect probably not, actually. So I think by and large, we are talking about a treaty here that lots of people were campaigning for, lots of people wanted to happen. The P5 didn't particularly want it to happen, but you know, I think we were sanguine that it probably would or could happen, but that it wouldn't actually advance our common goal of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. I think that was our fundamental difficulty with this, and it still is. We also, of course, weren't. I mean, the quote that you put up there suggests that we might have joined in negotiations on a treaty we were never going to sign. Article 6 of the NPT commits us to good faith negotiations, and that's what we're engaged in. We're certainly not going to engage in negotiations in a treaty that we know we're not going to sign. That would be bad faith. So I think that's just a few framing remarks on sort of how we approach this as I understand it. Just briefly then on the sort of 5 episodes that Richard highlights, and it was interesting for me as somebody who wasn't there to relive some of these through another's eyes. The key one, of course, I think is the humanitarian initiative, the humanitarian impact initiative. It's true that we did not attend the 2013 Oslo conference. We as the UK, I think, were always quite interested in the humanitarian impact initiative. Baroness Ainley said in the 2015 RevCon that we understood the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. You know, this is something that we did engage with. We didn't go to that conference, I think, because we understood from Norway that this wasn't intended to become a series. This wasn't intended to become a sort of separate process. So. I mean, maybe we could have gone, maybe we could not, but I don't think we saw it at the time as being anything more than a conversation about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And that was a conversation we were engaged with in other fora and were quite happy to engage with ourselves. I understand that if the arrangements for the second conference had been different, then some of the P5 states would have gone. We went to Vienna, as did the US. All of this time we were engaging in something that we thought was a genuine conversation about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. I think it became apparent, as I understand it, that this was not the case, and that others were using this to promote something different, which was the ban treaty. as I say, I think we cared about this initiative, but when we understood that this was not something that we thought it was, that's when it became that there was no consensus about this. And it wasn't just us; other states were also declined to participate further beyond Vienna. I think that's a pity, in a way. This was, I think Richard's right that this was a fork in the road. That fork led to the TPNW, and that was the road that was taken. But it came at the cost of losing the engagement of the people who actually possess nuclear weapons in a conversation about their humanitarian impacts. What that might have led to, I don't know, and we'll never know, because the humanitarian impact conversation with the P5 is now off the table. I think actually we could have ended up with something much more interesting than a treaty that the nuclear weapon states aren't going to sign. I think we could have ended up with a genuine conversation about how to mitigate the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, and that could have been a useful collective conversation on disarmament. But that's not what we ended up with, and so here we are today. Richard's second point about our reaction to the you characterise our reaction to the humanitarian initiative as being to sort of fall back on the comfort blanket of nuclear weapons as being as having security benefits. Thank you for your highly selective quote from the 2014 statement. We have always been very, very clear that we possess nuclear weapons because we see a security need for them. We have always been equally clear that we will give up those weapons if our security can be guaranteed without them. I think that is fairly common understanding amongst the P5. We talk about undiminished security for all being one of the key points of negotiations towards nuclear disarmament. So I think the characterisation Richard's put on it willfully misreads what we were saying at the time. It's no different from what we've always said, which is that in the current security environment, we see a security benefit to having nuclear weapons. We want to work for a time in which the security environment means we no longer need those weapons. And I don't think we've ever said anything different. So I think to say this calls into question our sincerity is wrong, because I think we say what we've always said. You also said it calls into question our realism. I think that may be true in a way, because in the real world, nuclear disarmament is going to come about as a two-way street with security. In a world, if we can find ourselves to a world in which our collective security as a whole world, not just as nuclear weapon states, can be guaranteed without nuclear weapons, then that's the world we want. But that's the realistic road to nuclear disarmament. Your third point about being aggressive and confrontational, again, this is where I will plead that we are the UK, and I can't speak for the speechwriters of my P5 colleagues. I don't think we were aggressive or confrontational. I think we, again, set out pretty clearly the way we see nuclear weapons in security doctrines, that we see a different path to nuclear disarmament from that which the TPNW advocates took. And we were very clear in the impact that we thought this treaty would have. We still are very clear on the impact that treaty has. And again, some of the things that have been written about it since, I think agree with that. I would say our assessment was realistic. I don't know what else we could have said. I think if we had said, there, we understand your concerns and let's all get around and talk about it, you would probably all have all rightly laughed at us. I think we get points for consistency if nothing else. And I think I would ask here again, was this a turning point? I don't think it was. Did anything we said in that conference chamber really convince people who were on the fence to vote for a TPNW who weren't already going to? It certainly didn't convince people who saw their security interests as being working with the nuclear weapon states to act any differently from how they did. So I think you can talk about the PR merits of certain phrases or whatever, but did it really change anything? I don't think so. Fourthly, the US document, you said it explains that the TPNW will in fact work as intended. I still don't think we know exactly how that is intended to work. But I think what we've, again, what we said was that the ban would be ineffective because none of the people who actually possess nuclear weapons would accede to it. The US paper didn't show how the ban would work. It said how it showed that people who signed the treaty would find it difficult to have a security relationship with the nuclear weapon possessor states. Again, I don't think anything's changed anything has happened to change our opinion on that. Again, you make a highly selective selection of quotes, implying that they're saying the same things. They're not. The normative and practical impacts from the ICANN report are totally different from what the US was talking about in terms of it having impact on non-parties. So I think we need to be very clear what that paper was doing, and again I don't think anything has changed our assessment on that. Finally, the press conference. Big caveat: I wasn't there. I certainly wasn't advising anyone who took part in that press conference. But again, I think you're right to say this was actually pretty insignificant. This was already a done deal by that point. I don't think our actions there changed anybody's minds. It probably generated a few easy headlines in the local pages on the BBC website, which is fine. But actually, the things that put nuclear weapons on the front page aren't initiatives like this. They are what's happening in North Korea. There's what's happening in other sort of non-proliferation projects. So I think fine. It may not have been the press officer's finest hour, but I don't think it really changed anything. So I think in sum, I mean, yes, highly entertaining and a useful look back at the process to what led to the TPNW. But really, I look back at this more in sorrow than in anger, because I think what we could have had in 2013 was a process that really brought people together and introduced another angle into the debate on nuclear weapons. What we've ended up with, despite I think everybody's best intentions, genuinely, is something which still divides us, and that's really not helpful to our common cause of nuclear disarmament. It's something we're committed to, it's something we will continue pursuing, but we're not going to be able to pursue it through the TPNW. This is not the vehicle for abolishing nuclear weapons, I'm sorry. So I think we need to move on, and we need to get back to a collective discussion about exactly how that's going to happen in the future, beginning, I hope, at the next year's RevCon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just a kind reminder, we're not trying to do pros and cons of the TPNW.
I did.
Wow. Anyways, last but not least, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard, for the very dense, in a good sense, very substantive lecture. There's a lot to react on. Unlike the ambassador, surprisingly, I agree with a lot of the points that Richard made, although I don't necessarily give as much weight to some of them as he did, because perhaps in some respect I agree, especially with the last point, one before last point about the press conference. So I will highlight some of the issues that I do agree with, and maybe add a little bit on the factors that I think influenced what happened since 2013, 2012. So point number one, I do believe that boycotting the Oslo conference was a fundamental mistake on the part of the nuclear weapon states. But I also think it was within the pattern, a broader pattern of what was happening at the time. And what I think was happening is this upswell of activism on the part of non-nuclear weapon states. Something was in the air, something was in the water, but since the 2011, I think, first committee going forward, there was a growing activism on the part of non-nuclear weapon states coming up with all kinds of initiatives on nuclear weapons, which was a little bit unusual because, as Richard said, the P5 usually controls the action, controls the discourse on nuclear weapons. And all of a sudden we saw quite a lot of activism and initiative coming from non-nuclear weapon states, which was met by variably dismissal or hostility by the nuclear weapon states. And so the reaction to the Oslo conference was very similar to the reaction to the open-ended working group proposal. And it was, I think, motivated or probably can be explained by the fundamental failure to understand just how much non-nuclear weapon states were fed up and how much potential they had built up for action for one reason or another by that point. And I think other than just the very fact of refusing to go to the Oslo conference, I think it's the phrasing by the nuclear weapon states of the reasons why. And I think we keep hearing that. And one was that it's a diversion from the established and legitimate disarmament fora and disarmament programs. And that really was offensive to non-nuclear weapon states, and that's what I think added to the energy in the room in Oslo and subsequently. And the other was this idea that we already know what the consequences are, so there is no need for that kind of discussion. Like sort of, we understand we don't need to be there. Not only don't we need to be there, you don't need to be there because you don't have nuclear weapons, and this whole thing is just entirely unnecessary. Granted, different nuclear weapon states sounded a little different. Russia was particularly dismissive. I think France was particularly dismissive. The US, UK might have been a bit more careful in their choice of words. But another thing that happened, and that was also the emerging process at the time, is the P5 consultations. And the unfortunate impact that had is that it seemed like it was some kind of a P5 echo chamber. They might be all different countries, they might have all different positions, and yet when it came to that, the joke at the time was the P5 consulted and adopted the French position. Whatever individual opinions were within that group on this emerging humanitarian initiative, somehow the most dismissive, the most arrogant came out as a common position in 2013. It wasn't repeated for the later conferences. I think some of the lessons were learned, but I think by then it was too late. By the time the United States and the United Kingdom showed up in Vienna for the Humanitarian Initiative Conference, the ship had sailed. I think that it didn't make as much difference as it could have had they gone into the first meeting and talked about how they do understand the humanitarian consequences, and this is what we've learned. I don't believe that this was a lost chance in terms of turning this whole tide into the discussion of mitigation of consequences, because I don't think discussion of mitigation of consequences is not disarmament. But I think what it could have done is change the dynamic in the room by allowing the P5 to pretty much control the discourse as they usually do on nuclear weapons. The arrogance unfortunately continued. And I think it was also evident in the 2016 vote and in the run-up to the 2016 vote that Richard talked about. I think the fundamental error that continues, and that is the failure of the P5 to put up an alternative vision of disarmament. There emerged a very convincing discourse in the humanitarian initiative about why this is necessary, why this is a risk, why the risk of use of nuclear weapons is something we cannot really live with. On the other side, there was just the repetition that we do have a step-by-step plan as the most effective approach. Now, what does that plan entail? Where is it going? How it's going to go? I think that is still missing. And what the P5 did between 2010 and 2015 is turn the 2010 action plan into some kind of an over-the-horizon roadmap, which wasn't the intent behind the action plan, but it fueled the perception, as Richard said, among the non-nuclear weapon states that there's no urgency, there is no actual plan to accomplish this disarmament. So I think Oslo itself, the boycotting of Oslo was a mistake, but it was also part of the broader set of actions and attitudes that made it so problematic, and that made it basically impossible for the P5 to stop the tide, even if Mr. Liddle says that there was no attempt to stop it. And I think that's also indicative of this kind of contradictory approach that the nuclear weapon states adopted to the humanitarian initiative. On the one hand, they were very dismissive of it, especially in the beginning. This is not something that is worth our participation. This is not worth anybody's really participation, because again, we understand all the facts. On the other hand, we're going to use very strong language to tell you to stop it. You know, stop the silliness and return to normal channels. And that's very much kind of the Russian approach to things. What I think was missing from well, it wasn't missing, but Richard didn't place as much emphasis on it as I would have. And that's a couple of missing opportunities to, again, try to turn the tide a little bit away from the negotiations. And that was the 2015 review conference. I think just procedurally, there was a chance for the nuclear weapon states to significantly delay, if not outright prevent, what happened at the 2015 First Committee, and then subsequently, of course, 2016 First Committee. We came very close at the review conference to adopting a final document that was profoundly disappointing to the civil society, and especially the ban promoters. It was very disappointing to the disarmament advocates, but they were prepared to live with it. They were prepared to take a document that had a very watered down language about humanitarian initiative and its significance, and that didn't contain any actions that would have led directly to the negotiations. It made this concession about let's maybe have an open-ended working group, but no negotiating mandate, and let's have it operate on the basis of consensus. And again, much to the disappointment of ban activists, a number of states that were pushing for the humanitarian initiative were prepared to live with that document for a variety of reasons, one of which was the Middle East. If there were progress on the Middle East, states like South Africa, I think Mexico, Austria, they were all prepared to go ahead and support the final document. Ironically, it's the Middle East that brought down the conference. But had the nuclear weapon states gone ahead and adopted that and lived with that document, we wouldn't have had an open-ended working group that ended up with a very strong, I think, recommendation to negotiate a nuclear weapons ban. And then in the run-up to the 2015 First Committee, again, two competing discussions emerged about open-ended working group and what it should be like. And it was funny how Iran came up with a resolution that was closest to the P5 position. And then the P5 didn't find it in themselves to tell the Iranians that, yes, we will vote for your resolution, which prompted Iran to withdraw the resolution. They were going to lose with the NAM anyway, but they managed to turn the whole thing into, you know, the P5 weren't going to support us, so we're going to withdraw this resolution. It's all the weapon state's fault. I think, again, had they succeeded in adopting a resolution to establish open-ended working group operating on the basis of consensus, it would have been, again, much harder, I think, for the ban proponents to turn that into the segue into the negotiations. I think by the time the 2016 First Committee was going to adopt the resolution establishing negotiations, it was too late. Whatever the P5 had done, whether they were less aggressive or more aggressive, I don't think they would have been able to stop. So I think they just increased the gusto with which many delegations voted for that resolution, and they maybe added some states on the margins, but I think by then it was too late. I think they lost the plot basically at the 2015 first. They completely lost the 2015 First Committee. I think by then that was over. But the most significant damage was done in 2013, 2014. I was waiting for Florence, so I'll stop there.
So it's not always easy to catch people's eyes. But thank you to our, actually, does this work? Does this work? Yes. So thank you to our three panelists, and thank you to Richard for actually setting this up. Now it's to you to ask the prickly questions, the comments, your reactions to Richard, but also to the two panelists. And I'll hand the mic around. Do say who you are, and if you're from a member state, say who you're from or an institution, so that people can know where you sit on this debate.
Thank you. I'm Pavel Podvig at Unizir. What was the name? Let me ask, since we're talking about the process and since the Oslo conference emerged as a key point in the process, there was, I remember, there was a very interesting Twitter exchanges, these things happen these days, about this conference, and the charge from the skeptics was that basically, in a way, this whole conference was held under false pretenses in a way, that sort of it was the humanitarian initiative, and that then it was turned into this TPNW trade. And I think that Ambassador sort of hinted at that might have been this kind of a fork. And the supporters of the TPNW basically said, no, that was the whole plan from the very beginning. So I don't have a dog in this fight, particularly. I don't have an opinion.
You'll do.
Well, I do, but
it's your future.
No, I mean in a sense that I don't know exactly what happened then there, and I would be very very interested in hearing from you. Sort of, what's your take? Whether this humanitarian initiative was intentionally used to push for the treaty, or it just happened to turn into that process, or what's you were in that process?
I think I will take 2 or 3 and then go back to the panel so that we have all the voices heard. Anybody else?
Hi, my name is Rijn Gaukhar. I'm with the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands, but I have a bit of an interesting history because I arrived here in 2015 working for the United Nations and also being a little bit involved in the 2016 Open-Ended Working Group. And I know this discussion is much about the role of the P5, but one of the interesting things I think about this last Open-Ended Working Group was that the original final document did not have an explicit reference to starting negotiations, to recommending that. And then one delegation called for a vote, and then that led to amendments, because first there was a consensual text. So I would like to see your views on how that might have impacted that, because also the role of those states, I think, played a role, because looking back then when you could see the discussion, especially here in Geneva, got very sour already, and the idea was already very clear, but to what extent did that last thing that the Open-Ended Working Group report really recommended negotiations also give an impetus to the 2016 First Committee? Thanks.
I love how everybody's saying I'm speaking in my own capacity, not in my official one. Vanessa, and then we'll go back to the...
Thanks for that question, Ran. I think I know Richard's views already. Vanessa Wood from the Australian Mission. I found the presentations very interesting. One question I have is, looking forward, how are we going to manage this issue in the 2020 RevCon? And I think that already the first 2 preparatory committees, there's already been a lot of kind of division over how the TPNW is reflected in just the chairman's document, and they are not consensus documents. I mean, I think that one thing that when everyone talks about this, we all come back to the NPT and our interests in the NPT, but TPNW supporters argue that they think the TPNW helps to implement Article 6. Other countries disagree with that, including my own. But I think that, you know, I just do not see how we're going to be able to reconcile views on this treaty in time for 2020 for it to be in either side's interest to have this issue be a divisive issue in the NPT RevCon. So I don't know the answer about how we're going to handle it, but I'm really interested in hearing any bright ideas. Thank you.
I had a plea for a follow-up question, so I'll just allow that as an exception and then go back to the panel.
Thank you very much. I'll be very short. I'm Susanne Hammer with the Austrian Mission, and I'm not going to talk about the TPNW here, but I have a very quick question on Gaukhar's comment regarding what are the alternatives, because I think also looking at the title Nuclear Diplomacy and the Limits of Power, I would be very keen to hear from the panelists what role non-nuclear weapon states can actually play in the NPT now post-2015, and how we can contribute to the debate, and that is obviously also directed to the representative from the P5, even though not representing the P5. Thank you.
So, panel, pick your question, pick your answer.
Right, thanks. I'll kick off. First on Pavel's question, that's a very good one actually, because it gives me, it's good for me because it gives me a chance to get back at something Aidan said. This idea of false pretenses, as you put it, there was this idea among critics of the humanitarian impact movement that it was, it was a false flag, it was a cover for this sinister plot to develop a treaty banning nuclear weapons. Now, I think that was true in a sense, but it was true for a vanishingly small number of actors, both in civil society and among governments. And I think where I would disagree, I mean, of course we have very different perspectives, but where I think quite strongly disagree with something you said, Aidan, was that there was this movement from the beginning, and so nothing the P5 could have done would have had any impact. But I'm sure, as our friends from ICANN will confirm, it was an enormous struggle to build up this mass of support, because at the beginning there was none. So at the beginning there was no kind of false pretenses thing. I mean, yeah, okay, for a handful of people, but for most of the people going to Oslo, for most of the countries going to Oslo, no, there was no sort of sinister plan. They thought the ban treaty idea was curious but stupid, essentially. Unworkable, unrealistic, couldn't see how it would help. And it really took 3 years for ICANN and other, Austria and Mexico and others to sort of build up this bulk of consensus that was enough to push something through the first committee. So I disagree with you, Aidan, that the P5, we can talk a lot about what better tactics might have been, but I think really early on you could have influenced this, because this conspiracy wasn't there at the beginning. It was certainly small enough to be influenced. And I think one of the great ironies of this whole process is that the P5, I think, and you're quite right, Aidan, to say that you have very different positions on almost everything, but as a whole, the P5 really saw the potential of this humanitarian initiative from the start, that it could lead to a prohibition treaty, and that they didn't like that. This came to them in a sort of almost instinctively. And so it's ironic, they got it straight away. But it took ICANN and the core group and others like 3 long, difficult years to persuade everyone else. So the P5 sort of saw this as this false pretense, this trick to sort of get people to go onto this ban treaty track by drawing them into this humanitarian discussion. But it wasn't like that. It was a very tiny seed that grew, and I think the P5 could have influenced that. Rent, yeah, I don't know why Vanessa's so happy you asked that question. It was Australia, for those who don't know, it was Australia who called for the vote at the end of the open-ended working group. I think rather unwisely, but that's not what we're discussing here. But your question is, what if there had been that consensus version of the report? I think it would probably have still gone ahead, because the important thing was not what the report said. It was illustrating to all the non-nuclear weapon states the extent of support. So the fact that there was now a large group, these 3 regional groups, all specifically endorsing the ban, this was the signal they needed to go with confidence into the first committee and push through a resolution. So it might have made it a bit more tricky, but I don't think Vanessa and her colleagues should feel too bad. It wasn't a decisive. Just quickly on how to handle the 2020 RevCon, looking forward. Really, I genuinely do not understand why this needs to be difficult. I mean, Aidan's commented on my sort of little speech that the P5 could give. If they said something like that, I really think 90% of their problems, or maybe not 90%, but a lot of their problems at the 2020 would evaporate. Because if they just, one of the objections to the TPNW is that it's divisive, but it's only divisive because they object to it. And if they just dropped it and said, okay, we didn't like it, but here it is, it's a reality. We have to find a place for the TPNW in the NPT sort of framework. Let's find some language that we can all live with. We acknowledge the existence of the TPNW. We acknowledge that certain states are making efforts to implement their Article 6 obligations, which apply to all states, not just nuclear weapon states. I don't think that's beyond the bounds of creative drafting and creative diplomacy, but it does require the P5 to just sort of drop their dukes a little bit and just say, okay, let's agree to disagree. You went this way, we prefer you went the other way, but here we all are, NPT, we want a constructive outcome. We will not make a big song and dance every time you want to mention the TPNW in the outcome document. It exists now. We can find a way to talk about it that's civil and acknowledges our differences but doesn't get in the way of agreement. And I'm interested in Aidan's view on that. Alternatives, I'll leave that to the others.
Gaukhar. Right, thank you. On the question about conspiracy or not, I also found it interesting that in the beginning, at least, the United States caught the whiff of it all and said it's a conspiracy to get to the Nuclear Weapons Convention. And being in DC, the view from DC at the time, I lived in Washington at the time, first was it was remarkable how long the think tanks in DC completely ignored the whole thing. They didn't wake up to the humanitarian initiative until the Vienna conference. Then they showed up in Vienna, sort of some of the more known figures, and then they were really publicizing it. And then some of us were telling the United States State Department all along, it's like, you're really missing the point, and it's really damaging not to engage. But for a while, the response was, this is a plot to get to the Nuclear Weapons Convention, and it's a silly thing to do. So it was that level of. On the other hand, France, I think, had a bit more paranoid view, and they were convinced that this is a really conspiracy from the beginning, which for some people it was, as Richard said. No, I wouldn't say it was a conspiracy, but there was an idea that we need to get to the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And if you're interested, there is a really fantastic article published in the Nonproliferation Review about a year or so ago by Rebecca Gibbons, and she interviewed a lot of people from behind the scenes who were among this small group that really thought of the concept of the ban, but they were not dictating where this was going, and had some of the nuclear weapons states engagement gone differently from the beginning, they may not have gotten to the ban in the end. The role of non-nuclear weapon states in the open-ended working group, 2016. Yeah, I think the whole point of that working group became to demonstrate how much support there was for the ban treaty, and had they had a consensus report, I think it might have even strengthened the position of the ban advocates to go ahead, because there is a certain sort of weight to a diplomatic document that's adopted by consensus versus a vote, and I don't know, maybe that's what Australia recognized on the eve of the final day of the working group, that they just can't get on board with a consensus that has some favorable references to the idea of possibly negotiating an instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons. And so they had to do what they had to do. I don't think it would have changed the course of the start of the negotiations. How are we going to deal with this in the 2020 review conference? Thank goodness for the ban treaty, because otherwise we'd have to focus on the fact that there's no US-Russian arms control negotiation happening, or any of the other things that should be happening. That's my concern, frankly speaking, that we'll spend all our time and energy fighting over language on the ban treaty instead of focusing on all the other practical steps that we had agreed upon before. And maybe we should revisit and maybe make some more concrete plans about implementing. And what Richard suggests, that all the sides should agree that they can live with some kind of reference to the ban treaty that won't satisfy completely, that won't completely endorse the ban, but also won't dismiss its existence. I think that would be possible to do, but only if there is something more substantive on the table in terms of furthering the arms control development actions. Because I don't think we can expect the ban, the majority of non-nuclear weapon states to simply take an acknowledgement that the ban exists in the absence of any other plan and commitment and action and promise of action. And in that sense, we are in a terrible situation right now because I frankly really don't know how the US and Russia are going to get on the same page in terms of what the next step should be. And I've been sounding like a broken record about the hello, we have the 2010 action plan. You guys can still revisit that and still make more, clarify some of the plans, what it is you're going to do the next 5-10 years if you insist on the 2010 action plan being the roadmap. But so far, all the focus has been on how do we address this terrible thing that happened in 2017 and is breaking the NPT. So my plea really to nuclear weapon states in particular is to come up with what I said they've been lacking so far, some kind of a vision and plan attached to the insistence that the step-by-step process is the way to go.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, before we go back to the questions, Aidan.
Thank you. So I'm not going to go back over the history of the Oslo conference because I wasn't there, and most of you were, so you would know that I was on shaky ground. So I'd rather look forwards. So I think Vanessa and Suzanne, your questions are very pertinent ones. I mean, I'm worried about how this will affect the 2020 RevCon, honestly, for the reasons that we just heard from Gaukhar. I think everybody says this is intended not to be divisive, but unless you mention it in a way that we want, and unless you give us something else, then we're not going to be able to accept the document. That sounds pretty divisive to me. I mean, to be honest, I agree with Richard that the way forward on this is not to go back over the pros and cons of the TPNW or agree or disagree on a particular road. I mean, speaking just for the UK again, I think it's absolutely right to say, we all want the same thing. We all want a world free of nuclear weapons. Let's figure out a way for us all to get there. And I think that if that's our collective approach to the 2020 RevCon, I think we've got a chance of succeeding. I think if we go down the route that Gaukhar suggests of saying, well, all right, we'll give you a slightly watered down reference to the BAM Treaty if you give us something else, then we're going to fail. We might as well not bother turning up. So I think if you don't want this to be divisive, then it doesn't have to be. But I think trying to ram a treaty down the P5's throats that we haven't signed and we said we're not going to sign is not the way of getting a consensual outcome in 2020.
Right. So we've got another 15 minutes or so before we hit the bar, so to speak. I see one hand over there. Anybody else on the side? Ladies first, and then we go to the other side.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for the presentation. I wasn't there, but I can imagine that I missed something after. but in any case, I just want to make a few comments. I mean, the TPNW is a reality, and I think what is important is to see how are we going to coexist in the regime. And sometimes I'm concerned because I think the disarmament agenda is not going very well, and this has nothing to do with the TPNW. And I think we have to recognize that, because it's not the TPNW what is preventing progress in nuclear disarmament. There are other issues, and I think we have to focus on that. And I don't see how the TPNW can be an issue to make something fail in the NPT review conference. So that point I just want to stress, because I hear it very often, but I don't see the basis for that, because at the end, the TPNW, whatever the opinions we have, it's a contribution to Article 6 and not a divisive issue, even if I can understand why P5 can perceive it otherwise. But my question is very simple, because I always hear statements saying nuclear weapons and security and the reference to humanitarian issues, like if they were something that apply in another universe, when at the end humanitarian and security issues are the two sides of the same coin. So, but I think we have to focus more on the whole issue of nuclear weapons and try to find a way to move forward. But I don't think that security and humanitarian aspects are issues that are separated, and I think we have to start discussing them as a part of a single coin, and I would like to have the opinion of the panelists on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Rami. I represent the permanent mission of Egypt, but I'm speaking on my personal capacity as well. Of course, when Egypt takes the floor, it's well known what issue we've put on the table. And speaking of what was mentioned by one of the speakers regarding the Middle East, and being one of the topics that usually is one of the huge issues that not helps in a very good way the NPT review conferences. Unfortunately, I can see many similarities between what happened with the TPNW and what's happening, or what happened and is happening now with the UNGA resolution on the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone that was adopted last year. The same mistakes, the same chronology, the same sequence, obligations not being fulfilled, commitments not being made, and the same mistakes are being made again, advertising for the success of the enemy, and we are the enemy in this case. Frankly speaking, I can see the analogy just being the same. And unfortunately, P5 as well, or some of the P5 countries, given their own and the special responsibility, are part of this, and they are repeating the same mistakes again. The Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone is one of the issues that will impact and will continue to impact the NPT until it's resolved. And like the TPNW, we don't see any progress, so that's why after maybe my country specifically started the efforts since 1974, and by 2018 we thought it was time to take it out of the official channels, if we can say, or to change the channel and take it to another track. What are the lessons that we should learn from what happened with the TPNW, and how we can avoid the failure to reach an agreement or an understanding between the P5 and the other states that were involved and advocating for the TPNW with regards to the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. Thank you.
So I've got two more questions. Sir in the middle, and then Daniel from ICANN. I don't mind which order, but any other questions, then we'll wrap up with Peter at the front. So we've got three. We'll do 1, 2, and 3.
Is that me first?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel from ICANN. I just want to thank all the speakers. Really, it was really excellent. It's always really kind of fun to go back and reflect on what happened. And there's big debates always about, whose idea was the ban really, and what happened when. The first thing I noticed, and I'm going to be quite short, which I have to be because I'm not allowed to talk about the TPNW, which cuts out like 90% of my talking points. So I'm just going to limit it to reflections really. The ramp up and the ramp down, I think broadly it's right. I think in retrospect, at the time, I think it was an emotional roller coaster, even for us in ICANN, displaying a very confident exterior, but it was some butterflies in the stomach at the time. The one thing I think that I would add to what perhaps contributed to the success of this, I think, was the atmosphere of the humanitarian initiative and the meetings, and especially the humanitarian initiative conferences. I don't want to trivialize the motivations for it, because obviously it is the humanitarian suffering, the voices of the Hibakusha, which really underpinned and certainly motivated us in civil society to work. But I think two things. There was obviously the element of humor, I think, which we've gotten today. There was a certain rogue entity called Wildfire, which popped up during the humanitarian initiative as well, and the atmosphere at the humanitarian initiative conferences was really, it was stark in how different it was from the CD or the Disarmament Commission, and as diplomats are not automatons, as they're human beings like everyone else, the spirit of it was very exciting. There was different kinds of speakers. There was, we would say, civil society very much engaged, voices from survivors. There was, I remember at the 2013 PrepCom, we heard there was spontaneous applause after the joint statement was read out by South Africa. The video that you showed there of the Algerian president mentioning it, that was very much civil society, clapping in the corner. But at the 2013 PrepCom, it was diplomats, it was governments in the room that spontaneously, applauded. And that was quite early in the day for me, but it was my understanding that this was something that was quite new and fresh. And so the atmosphere of the humanitarian initiative, it was a place that people wanted to be, and I think you can't underestimate the value of that kind of individual motivation, the individual passion of certain diplomats wanting to push this forward. Not in any way to take away from the kind of the principle of it, but I think that certainly should be underlined. And just finally, an anecdote about the photo that you showed of the protest, so-called protest. I think what was very poignant for that was that it was extremely. We were quite interested to get a list of who was at that press conference. It was very difficult to get confirmations from governments. It was nigh on impossible. I mean, obviously not going to name any countries, but we had one country. We asked them, were you a part of this, because we'd heard from someone who was there in the room. They denied it. They called us back twice, 2 days in a row, to confirm that they were not there. We had an incident. We showed the picture to a certain delegation and said, "Isn't this your colleague there?" And they said, "Well, I'll get back to you. Probably not." It was that kind of the absurdity that was a real feeling that we've actually got this. That this is okay. So I think I'd just point that. But I really want to thank Ambassador Liddle as well for the spirit in which you've spoken here today. Very congenial, and I think that's kind of what we need moving forward, is that kind of spirit. And it's certainly something that I can. Obviously, we're not going to step back from our strident position, but I think it's that kind of atmosphere that we also want to contribute to, because we think that's one of the biggest successes of the humanitarian issue and the humanitarian conferences. Is this kind of new way, a new spirit in which we can actually be excited about disarmament as well, because it's not always seen like that from the outside. So I'm sorry for not asking a question, Flo. I hope you'll forgive me.
Light-hearted, also my timekeeping.
It is Nakai from Japanese delegation. Ichiro-san, actually I'm very intrigued to hear your idea on the possible P5 rhetorics or response to the TPNW movement. Therefore, I'm happy if I can ask the same question of Ambassador Liddle, which is, would it work if P5 had used that rhetoric or had sent such a message? Disarmament has long been the forum among the professionals and experts, but these days it has come to be a characteristic of the public diplomacy. Quite often it has become very important to appeal to the many stakeholders, mass number of people. Anti-personal mine treaty, Banco Treaty, cluster, and TPNW might be the typical case. And your idea seems to have a very good PR merit or PR tactics in order to deliver the P5 stance. Therefore, Ambassador Liddle was of a view that it would not have changed the results so much. But at the same time, you have repeated that it was tremendously difficult task to amass the support for TPNW. Therefore, I'm happy if I can have your view. What would happen if P8 had sent such a message while you are struggling to increase the support for TPNW? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Peter Herby, I'm an independent arms control consultant, but with a lot of background with the Red Cross and ICRC, including on this issue. One of the questions put to you was about what do we do? One of the questions put to you was about what about 2020? Are we going to have another disaster? And my question is, would it really be too much if the NPT states could collectively affirm something like what was said by Gorbachev and Reagan a couple decades ago, that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. it seems to me, if we're talking about bridging the gap and stopping this dichotomy between TPNW and the NPT, and between security and the humanitarian narrative, it's a pretty simple message to say that nuclear war can't be won, must never be fought, and to reaffirm that from 2010 that nuclear weapons have catastrophic humanitarian implications. But of course, just stating that collectively is to begin to try to turn the tide away from this debate and away from a drift over the brink, which seems to be where we're going, with decades of modernization to look forward to complete impasse in US-Russian negotiations, etc., etc. So a simple conceptual statement like that, which is in some ways stating the obvious, does have implications on threats. It has implications for modernization, has implications for turning the tide. So I just wonder if that's too much to hope for.
Thank you, Peter. Now you have 5 minutes, guys, to answer those complex questions before the room empties to the wine bar, along with myself. So perhaps in reverse order, we'll start with Aidan.
In fact, I probably have a bit less than 5 minutes because I have somewhere else I need to be. But some very good questions. I'll just pick up on two, if I may. I think first, Socorro, I absolutely agree with you, actually, that the humanitarian impact question and security are closely related. I don't think there's a dichotomy between them. This is why I think this process has been so unfortunate, because the humanitarian initiative was used to get to the TPNW and to create something, to create a different vehicle. It's now become seen as being two opposing things. I don't think that's the case, but I think it's now quite difficult to break out of that dualist debate. And this is why I think that if the 2013 initiative had been handled differently, probably by both sides, then we could have had a conversation which much more closely links those two aspects. So I think it's a matter of regret. I'm not placing any blame, but I think it's a matter of regret that didn't happen. So yeah, hopefully in time we can get back to that conversation. But I think now we have an additional hurdle to get over before we can really have that conversation seriously, which is a pity. But I also agree with what you said about at the 2020 review conference needing to move beyond that. I think we do, and I'm sure we can